In the winter of 1574, beneath the cold, gray skies of Copenhagen, a child was born who would one day influence the fate of two kingdoms, and of Denmark, the daughter of King Frederick II and Queen Sophia of Mecklenburg, arrived into a world where politics, religion, and ambition intertwined to shape the destinies of rulers and their subjects. Little did the young princess know, her life would soon be tethered not only to her native Denmark, but also to a distant throne in England. Far from the icy shores of the Baltic Sea, the early years of Anne's life were marked by the privilege of royal birth, but also the inherent expectations that came with it. As the youngest child of the Danish monarchs, she was largely overshadowed by her older siblings and had the luxury of growing up in the protective shadow of her father's court. Yet, Anne was no mere passive princess. Even as a child, she exhibited intelligence and curiosity that would later define her reign as Queen Consort of England. Her story begins not with the bustling courts of Denmark, but in the quiet moments of contemplation in the royal palace, where she often found herself lost in thought. As a child, Anne would often wander through the great halls of the Amalienborg Palace, gazing out at the rolling landscapes beyond, her young mind already pondering the future that lay ahead. Anne's early years were shaped by the looming presence of the Protestant Reformation, a time of political and religious upheaval in Europe. Her family was deeply rooted in Protestantism, and Anne herself would grow up to become a devout follower of the faith. In Denmark, King Frederick II's reign was marked by the struggles of consolidating power within the Protestant cause, and his influence stretched far beyond the borders of Denmark. Yet, despite the political tensions surrounding her, Anne's childhood remained relatively peaceful, nestled within the comforts of her royal household. At the age of 14, Anne was introduced to a different world, a world far from the familiar northern shores of Denmark. The marriage proposal arrived unexpectedly, but it was no less strategic. The young Anne was to marry James VI of Scotland, a man she had never met but who was already a king, albeit of a kingdom much smaller than Denmark. In a time when political alliances were cemented by marriage, this union promised to strengthen the ties between Denmark and Scotland. But what lay beneath the surface of this royal marriage? Was it simply political expediency, or could there have been a deeper connection between the two young royals? In the spring of 1589, Anne set sail for Scotland to meet her future husband. The journey was perilous and fraught with challenges. A fierce storm delayed her arrival, and for months, Anne's presence in Scotland remained uncertain. In that time, James VI grew increasingly impatient, his mind consumed with the thoughts of what awaited him: a new queen, a foreign wife, and the political ramifications of this unexpected union. In a moment of desperation, he began to write to Anne, desperate to reassure her and to express his excitement at the thought of their eventual meeting. But Anne, as the storm raged outside her ship, found herself questioning her own decision. Was this marriage truly her destiny? Or had she been swept along by the tides of politics and diplomacy? There, on the deck of her ship, she peered out at the tumultuous waves, wondering what awaited her in Scotland. The storm that raged outside was symbolic of the challenges Anne would face in her marriage and in the political arenas of both Scotland and England. It was not merely a physical storm, but the beginning of a much deeper and more complex journey. A journey that would span decades and carry her from the cold and windswept shores of Scotland to the heart of the English monarchy. When Anne finally arrived in Edinburgh, it was under the cover of a heavy fog. The city, with its towering castles and narrow streets, seemed both mysterious and intimidating. James, who had waited for her for so long, greeted her with warmth and anticipation. Despite her uncertainties, was struck by his sincerity and earnestness. There was a connection between them, a quiet bond that was not immediately obvious but that would grow in time. James, a man of intense intellect and political ambition, saw in Anne not just a wife, but a political ally. He needed her to help secure his claim to the English throne. which was becoming increasingly precarious as Elizabeth I of England had no direct heirs. For her part, was determined to be more than just a figurehead. She wanted to be a powerful partner to James, a force in her own right in the world of politics and diplomacy. But the early years of their marriage were not without difficulty. Having grown up in a Catholic-dominated Denmark, found herself thrust into a Protestant Scotland, where the religious tensions were palpable. Her devotion to Catholicism was at odds with the Protestant court she now found herself in, and she was soon forced to navigate the delicate balance of political and religious loyalty. The relationship between Anne and James was tested, not just by the external pressures of their respective courts, but also by the more personal and intimate strains that came with marriage. James, while kind and devoted, was also a man of many desires, both intellectual and carnal. His affections were often divided between Anne and the many favorites he kept in his court. This dynamic would be a defining feature of their relationship, with and struggling to maintain her role as queen consort in the face of James' more unconventional alliances. When Anne set foot in the royal court of Scotland, the cold, harsh winds of the north seemed to reflect the emotional turbulence she would experience. The grandeur of Edinburgh Castle loomed above her, and the narrow, winding streets felt like a labyrinth to the young queen. Anne was now not just a princess. She was a queen consort, the wife of a king with a divided realm, struggling to maintain control over a country torn by religious discord and political instability. James VI of Scotland, though a king by title, was far from a stable monarch. As a ruler, he was keenly aware of the delicate balance he had to strike. Scotland, while under his reign, was a land marked by religious tensions. The Protestant Reformation had shaken the foundations of Scotland, and now, decades later, the consequences of this religious division were still felt. Catholicism, which Anne had been raised to cherish, was outlawed in Scotland, and the Protestant court demanded conformity. Anne's devotion to her faith made her an outsider in a court where Protestantism was the dominant force, and where political loyalty often hinged on religious belief. James, despite his political acumen, was a man divided. As the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and a Catholic, he had a deep connection to the old faith. Yet his reign as King of Scotland was shaped by the Protestant cause. His marriage to Anne, a Catholic princess, was a move that seemed fraught with tension. Would he be able to reconcile his wife's faith with the political needs of his kingdom? The early years of their marriage were defined by this clash of ideologies. Who had grown up in the lavish Catholic courts of Denmark, found herself surrounded by cold, unwelcoming Protestant ministers who made no secret of their disdain for her religious beliefs. Even her own court officials treated her with skepticism, unsure of how to handle a queen whose allegiance was, at best, ambiguous. The pressure on Anne was immense. She had come to Scotland not merely as a queen consort, but as a symbol of hope, a potential bridge between two conflicting worlds. But the weight of this symbolism was suffocating. Anne's relationship with her husband was, at first, somewhat distant. James was often preoccupied with the affairs of state and his intellectual pursuits. While he adored his wife, his political ambitions frequently kept him away from her. The court, full of intrigue and backbiting, was a place where Anne, the foreign queen, found herself struggling to establish her place. Despite the outward appearances of harmony, the couple's marriage began to suffer. James, ever the scholar and politician, spent countless hours engrossed in his own studies and the complexities of Scottish politics. Feeling increasingly isolated in a foreign land, began to withdraw into herself. Her loneliness became a constant companion. She had not anticipated the stark reality of the Scottish court, where her foreignness and her faith were constant sources of tension. Anne's most trusted confidant during these early years was her maid of honor, the English noblewoman Lady Sarah Mallory. Lady Sarah, who had accompanied Anne from Denmark, was one of the few people Anne could trust completely. It was through Sarah that Anne began to understand the intricacies of Scottish politics, especially the growing tensions between the Protestant factions and the Catholic sympathizers. It was Sarah who advised Anne to build alliances with the more moderate factions in the court, suggesting that Anne's personal influence might be the key to winning James's favor and solidifying her position as queen. As the months passed, Anne began to adapt. She learned the ways of the Scottish court, the subtle art of diplomacy and negotiation, and how to navigate the delicate religious divisions that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Her natural intelligence and keen understanding of political dynamics began to shine through, and James started to see her not just as his wife, but as an invaluable partner in his reign. Yet, despite these early successes, Anne's position was precarious. James's favorite at court, the young Robert Carr, had quickly become a source of tension between the royal couple, whose loneliness had been exacerbated by James's growing infatuation with Carr, found herself facing a new challenge, one that would test her resilience and her ability to hold on to her power within the court. The arrival of Robert Carr at the Scottish court marked a new chapter in Anne's life. Carr, a handsome and charismatic young man, quickly gained James's favor. To James, Carr was not just a companion. He was an intellectual equal, a trusted confidant who shared his interests in philosophy and theology. But to Anne, Carr was a threat, a man who seemed to draw James's attention away from her. The affection that James lavished on Carr was not merely that of a king for a favorite, but something deeper, more personal, and had always prided herself on her intelligence and independence. But now she found herself in the difficult position of competing for James's affections with a younger, more dynamic man. While Anne remained the queen, she began to feel more like a sidelined figure in her own court. The power dynamics between James, Carr, and Anne shifted, and James's reliance on Carr grew ever more evident. Yet, Anne was no fool. She knew that, in the world of politics, appearances mattered as much as substance. She began to use her position to her advantage, subtly cultivating her own network of supporters in the court. Her natural charm, intelligence, and growing political acumen made her an increasingly influential figure, even as James's attention drifted away from her. In the midst of these personal tensions, Anne's political ambitions began to grow. She understood that her marriage to James was not simply a personal union, but a political alliance with vast potential. While James was absorbed in the world of scholars and favorites, and saw the opportunity to build her own base of power, her ability to navigate the political landscape of Scotland was becoming her greatest asset, and she began to employ all her skills in ensuring that her position as queen would not be usurped by Robert Carr or anyone else. By the early 1590s, Anne had given birth to her first child, a son who would eventually become Charles I of England. Motherhood brought Anne a new sense of purpose. The birth of her child, in many ways, represented the future of her reign and her dynasty. She was no longer just a foreign queen in a distant land. She was now a mother, with the legacy of her bloodline resting on her shoulders. The arrival of her son also marked a shift in her relationship with James. While his attentions continued to be divided between his intellectual pursuits and his favorites, the birth of a child seemed to spark a renewed sense of connection between the two. However, Anne's role as a mother was not without its challenges. Childbirth, while a source of joy, was also a source of great peril for Anne. As it was for many women of her time, she had endured several difficult pregnancies, and each one was a constant reminder of the fragility of life. The fear of losing her child, or worse, of losing her own life in childbirth, became a constant presence in her mind. Anne's growing family created new opportunities for her to exert influence within the court. Her role as mother gave her a new platform from which to speak, and she began to use this position to further solidify her power. The birth of her children was seen as a blessing by her supporters, and she used their affection for her children to strengthen her ties with the Scottish nobility. Yet, despite these new opportunities, Anne's position remained uncertain. The constant political and religious struggles in Scotland, combined with her personal tensions with James, left her feeling isolated and uncertain of her future. In 1603, when Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, passed away, the union of Scotland and England was formalized. James VI of Scotland ascended the English throne as James I, marking the beginning of a new era. His reign brought with it a promise of unity, but it also brought Anne into the limelight as Queen of England, a role she had never anticipated. Anne's transition from the harsh, windswept courts of Scotland to the opulent, bustling palaces of England was far from smooth. She had always been a foreigner in Scotland, but in England, she was more so. English culture, court politics, and the expectations placed on a queen consort were different, even more so when the previous queen had been so iconic. Elizabeth I had defined what it meant to be an English monarch. Her reign was marked by her singular authority and her refusal to marry, making Anne's position as a foreign Catholic queen even more precarious. When Anne first arrived in England, she was greeted with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and skepticism. Many English courtiers were unsure of the new queen, who came from a land with very different customs. The tension was palpable. Anne was not only a foreign queen, but a Catholic queen in a Protestant country, inheriting a court that had lived under Elizabeth's Protestant regime for decades. It would be a difficult transition for Anne, and one fraught with complexities. The English court was teeming with ambition. Politicians, nobles, and courtiers all sought favor from the new king and queen, and Anne quickly learned that her role would be as much about survival as it was about influence. The political intrigues in England were far more intricate than what she had encountered in Scotland. Here, the stakes were higher. Anne's presence was meant to represent a new chapter, but it also served as a reminder of the fragility of the union between the two kingdoms. Her Catholic faith would always be a source of tension, and her ability to navigate the religious and political landscape would be her greatest challenge. As James I settled into his new role as King of both England and Scotland, and found herself not only as a queen consort but as a symbolic figure of unity between the two nations. Her life was now dictated by the whims of the English court, where rumors and rivalries flowed like the tides, and James, her husband, her partner, was often distant. He was deeply preoccupied with his new responsibilities, focusing on governing the kingdom, dealing with Parliament, and attempting to consolidate power across both England and Scotland. From the very beginning of their marriage, Anne had known that James was not like other men. His intellectualism, his thirst for knowledge, his obsession with theology, and his seemingly endless correspondence with scholars across Europe made him a king unlike any other, and was often left to fend for herself. And this isolation soon became one of the defining features of their relationship. James's affections, though never lacking in warmth, were often directed elsewhere. His favorites, men such as Robert Carr, and later, George Villiers, captured much of his attention, while Anne, his queen, was left to navigate the political machinations of the court alone. The political system of England was fundamentally different from that of Scotland, and Anne, as a foreign queen, had little to rely on other than her own wits and charm. The arrival of George Villiers, an ambitious young courtier who quickly rose to become James's closest confidant, only exacerbated Anne's sense of alienation. Villiers was everything that Anne was not: young, charming, and thoroughly English. His presence at court added to the growing sense of tension between Anne and James. The Queen, once a confident figure in Scotland, now found herself increasingly sidelined in the English court. It was not just James's affections that kept Anne at arm's length, but his constant preoccupation with his royal duties. England was a land full of complex and often contentious politics. His desire to rule both Scotland and England as a unified kingdom was met with resistance from both sides, especially from English nobles who saw themselves as the true heirs of power. In this environment, Anne's role as queen became almost ceremonial, a symbolic position rather than a powerful one. For Anne, this new reality was challenging. She had grown used to being a strong presence in the Scottish court, but in England, she was merely a figurehead. Despite her own intelligence, political acumen, and sharp wit, her contributions were often overshadowed by the growing influence of James's favorites, especially George Villiers. In the early years of James's reign, Anne's isolation deepened. She began to rely more heavily on her own companions, including her ladies-in-waiting and trusted advisors. One of the few people she confided in was the German-born lady-in-waiting, Anne of Brandenburg. Together, they navigated the complexities of court life, forging a bond that would last throughout Anne's reign. Anne's Catholic faith, while a deeply personal matter, became increasingly difficult to conceal in a country that had firmly embraced Protestantism. Despite James's desire to present himself as a monarch who was tolerant of all religions, the tensions between Catholics and Protestants were never far from the surface in England. Anne's Catholicism made her a figure of both sympathy and suspicion. Many Catholics in England saw her as a beacon of hope, someone who could subtly influence James and perhaps lead England back toward religious tolerance. However, the Protestant factions at court were less than enthusiastic about the Queen's faith. They viewed her as a dangerous influence, and they were wary of the possibility that she might use her position to further Catholic interests in a country that had long since rejected papal authority. James, despite his personal sympathy for Catholics, could not afford to alienate his Protestant subjects. The religious divide in England was a fragile thing, and his political survival depended on appeasing the Protestant majority. Thus, Anne was often caught between two opposing forces: her desire to be loyal to her faith and her need to support her husband in his difficult political maneuvering. In the first years of their reign, Anne often hosted Catholic sympathizers at court, quietly supporting them in ways that were never fully acknowledged by the king. She took part in private masses and was rumored to provide shelter to Catholic exiles. But her actions remained veiled in secrecy, for to openly embrace Catholicism would be to risk the fragile unity James was trying to build between England and Scotland. One of the most significant moments in Anne's reign came in 1612, when a group of English Catholics, including several members of the royal household, were arrested for plotting to assassinate James and place Anne's son, Charles, on the throne. This so-called gunpowder plot was a moment of crisis that tested the Queen's resolve. It also marked the beginning of Anne's increasing alienation from James's government. Anne's role as a mother was of paramount importance to her. While her marriage to James was strained, the birth of their children provided her with a sense of purpose and connection. Her first son, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was born in 1594, but it was the birth of Charles, her second son, in 1600, that cemented her legacy as a mother. Charles would go on to become Charles I of England, a king whose own struggles with Parliament and his eventual execution would forever alter the course of English history. As a mother, Anne was deeply involved in the upbringing of her children, and her love for them was unconditional. The birth of Charles, however, was not without its struggles. Childbirth was dangerous, and Anne suffered greatly from the complications that arose after each of her pregnancies. It was a reminder to her of the fragility of life. Yet, her children gave her hope and a sense of purpose during some of the darker times in her reign, and was often called upon to play the role of a diplomatic mediator. But it was her maternal instincts that gave her the strength to endure the many trials that came with being queen consort. As the years passed, Anne became increasingly disillusioned with her position. James, ever the intellectual, remained distant, and the political intrigues of the English court wore on her. Anne's health began to deteriorate in the early 1610s, and she withdrew from public life for several years. Her later years were marked by illness, depression, and the growing distance between her and her husband. Though she continued to support James's reign and raised their children with great care, the life she had envisioned as queen was far from what she had hoped for. She died on March 2nd, 1619, at the age of 44, just as her son Charles was beginning to take on more responsibilities at court. Her death marked the end of an era in English history, as her son would soon ascend the throne as Charles I, and the conflicts between monarch and parliament would soon define England for generations to come. As and settled into her role as Queen Consort of England, the complexities of the English court weighed heavily on her. Her marriage to James I, which had been forged from political necessity, had evolved into a relationship of quiet distance. While Anne was devoted to her husband, James's intellectual pursuits and increasingly close relationship with his favorites, particularly George Villiers, made her position in the royal household a delicate balancing act. And had once hoped that her marriage to James would be one of mutual respect and partnership. But the early years of their reign had proven otherwise. James, a king deeply concerned with matters of state and his scholarly interests, often seemed oblivious to Anne's emotional needs. His love for her was genuine, but it was overshadowed by his obsession with his intellectual pursuits and his constant search for counsel and companionship among his favorites. Anne's role as queen was thus relegated to the background, while James basked in the glow of his new position as King of England. She was left to manage the everyday affairs of the royal court, to perform the ceremonial duties expected of a queen, and to navigate the fraught political waters of a nation divided by religious tensions. Her Catholic faith, a source of personal comfort, was also the cause of much division. England had been Protestant for over half a century, and James's ascension to the throne had done little to calm the animosities between the two factions. Anne's role was further complicated by the legacy of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's reign had been marked by her refusal to marry, and her reign was defined by the singular authority she wielded as a monarch. Anne's marriage to James, while politically beneficial, had left her in a difficult position. She was expected to be a mother to the nation, but her authority was constantly undermined by the perceived strength of her husband's reign. While James had the final say in political matters and exercised quiet influence in her own way, as a foreign queen, she was often seen as a diplomatic figure, a link between England and Europe, especially Denmark and the Catholic world. In the early years of James's reign, Anne's influence was felt in diplomatic matters, particularly in her correspondence with her family in Denmark, and was deeply connected to the Danish court. And her ability to foster relations between England and Denmark played a significant role in shaping the diplomatic landscape of James's early reign. Yet, despite her diplomatic efforts, Anne remained at the periphery of the English court. The political power at the time was held by a select few, noblemen and advisors who had James's ear. On the other hand, was confined to the palace, a figurehead who had little ability to effect real change. While James's reign seemed to be characterized by a certain intellectual openness, the realities of court politics were far more complex. Motherhood was a significant part of Anne's role as queen, and in many ways, it was the one aspect of her life that she could truly control. While her marriage to James had become more distant, her love for her children remained a constant source of joy and purpose, and had given birth to several children during her marriage. But her first son, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was the one who captured the nation's imagination. Henry was an intelligent and charismatic young man, and there was hope that he would be the one to unite England and Scotland under his rule. However, his untimely death in 1612 at the age of 18 was a devastating blow to Anne. The loss of her beloved son left a deep void in her heart, and she withdrew from public life for a time, grieving the loss of her heir. It was in the aftermath of Henry's death that Anne found solace in her second son, Charles. Charles would eventually become King Charles I of England, a monarch whose reign would be marked by conflict and tragedy. While Anne could not have known the path her son would take, she dedicated herself to raising him with the love and care she had given to Henry. Her maternal instincts were strong, and she sought to protect her children from the dangers of the court and the volatile politics of the time. Despite the personal tragedy of Henry's death, Anne's role as a mother remained one of her most important responsibilities. She was determined to ensure that Charles would be well prepared for the throne, even though she knew that his future would be fraught with difficulties. The tensions between the monarchy and Parliament were already beginning to surface during James's reign, and Anne was keenly aware of the political challenges that awaited her son. One of the most significant developments in Anne's reign was the growing influence of George Villiers, James's favorite, who quickly rose to prominence at court. Villiers, a young, handsome man with charm and ambition, became James's closest confidant, and his influence over the king only grew over time. While James had always had favorites, Villiers was different. He was not just a companion to the king, but a political figure in his own right, and his presence at court overshadowed and in many ways. For Anne, Villiers' rise was a personal blow. She had long been the queen, but Villiers' influence threatened to eclipse her in the eyes of the court. His close relationship with James was not just one of affection but one of power. James's trust in Villiers grew to such an extent that he began to appoint him to key positions within the royal household, effectively sidelining and from matters of governance. Ever the pragmatist, did not challenge James's relationship with Villiers directly. She knew that such an approach would only create further division between herself and the king. Instead, she withdrew into the more private spaces of the court, focusing on her children and her own inner circle of trusted advisors. She maintained a dignified silence, but her frustration was palpable. The presence of Villiers at court was more than just an issue of personal rivalry. It symbolized a broader shift in the power dynamics of the English court. Villiers was a force of change, and his rise marked the beginning of a new chapter in James's reign, one where his personal preferences began to take precedence over the traditional role of the queen consort. Anne's Catholicism remained a thorn in her side throughout her time in England. James had hoped that the union of England and Scotland would usher in a new era of religious tolerance. But the reality was far more complicated. The Protestant establishment in England was deeply entrenched, and Anne's Catholic faith was seen as a challenge to the status quo. James, despite his own Catholic sympathies, could not afford to alienate the Protestant majority. His political survival depended on maintaining the support of the English Parliament, which was dominated by Protestant interests. Caught between her own faith and her husband's political needs, was forced to exercise caution in her actions. Her private Catholic devotions were tolerated by James, who did not wish to publicly clash with his wife over religion. But the tensions at court were always present. Anne's presence at Massachusetts, her discreet support for Catholic exiles, and her quiet encouragement of Catholic causes were seen as signs of disloyalty by the Protestant factions at court. Her actions were carefully scrutinized, and every word she spoke was weighed for its potential to ignite religious discord. For Anne, the struggle was not just political, but deeply personal. Her faith was a source of strength and solace, but it also made her vulnerable in a country that had long since embraced Protestantism. She knew that her actions could be misconstrued, and she was forced to walk a tightrope, balancing her devotion to her faith with her role as queen consort of a Protestant nation. As Anne's health began to decline in the second decade of the 17th century, her role in the English court diminished further. She became increasingly isolated, not just from James, but from the court in general. Her distance from political affairs allowed James to focus more on his own interests, particularly his relationships with his favorites. Anne's death in 1619 marked the end of an era. She had lived through personal tragedy, political challenges, and religious tensions, yet she had always maintained a quiet dignity. Her death was mourned by those who had known her as a mother, a queen, and a figure who had navigated the complexities of a turbulent court with grace and resilience. Her legacy, though overshadowed by the events that followed her death, remained significant and had been a queen who had weathered the storms of political intrigue and personal loss. She had been the mother of a future king, and her role in shaping Charles I, whose reign would lead to the English Civil War, would be felt long after her passing. Anne's life after the death of her eldest son, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was irrevocably changed. The loss, both personal and political, left her reeling. Henry had been the bright hope for the future of the English monarchy, a young man brimming with intelligence, charisma, and ambition. His untimely death in 1612, from a fever at the age of 18, was a crushing blow to the Queen. Anne's grief was profound, and she withdrew from public life for some time. Henry's death not only deprived her of a beloved son, but also robbed England of a potential future monarch who might have helped unite the fractured kingdom. The death of the prince was a turning point in Anne's reign as queen consort, a moment that marked the beginning of a prolonged period of personal and political difficulty. James I, though deeply saddened by the loss of his son, seemed more focused on the political ramifications. He had already struggled with the fractious political environment in England, and Henry's death left him without a clear heir who could rally the country behind the crown. For Anne, however, it was the deep personal sorrow that dominated her days. The quiet corners of the court, once filled with the bustling noise of her children, were now silent. Who had been a devoted mother and a figurehead of hope for her family, now found herself facing an uncertain future. In the years following Henry's death, the distance between Anne and James grew more pronounced. Their marriage, once founded on genuine affection and political alliance, had become strained by the king's growing preoccupation with matters of state and his favored relationships. James's affection for his court favorites, particularly George Villiers, had deepened, and Anne found herself increasingly sidelined. James's relationship with Villiers, which had begun as a political alliance, evolved into something far more intimate. Villiers became James's closest confidant, with the king entrusting him with matters of both state and personal nature. This favoritism extended into almost every aspect of royal life, from appointments to the court to decisions about patronage and power. Though emotionally distant from her husband, never confronted the situation openly. Instead, she retreated into her role as a mother, tending to her surviving children, especially Charles, the second son. While James busied himself with court affairs, Anne's maternal instincts became more pronounced. She was determined to raise her children with the same care and devotion she had lavished on Henry, and she focused much of her energy on ensuring that Charles would be prepared for the throne. But her position as queen, always tenuous due to her Catholic faith and foreign origins, became even more difficult as James's political landscape shifted. With his increasing reliance on Villiers, Anne's influence at court was diminished. The queen consort was becoming a mere figurehead, overshadowed by the political machinations of the court. The court of James I had always been a place of intrigue and ambition, but it was during the early 1610s that the dynamics of royal power began to shift more dramatically. George Villiers, a young and handsome courtier from a noble family, had caught the eye of James and quickly become the king's closest confidant. Villiers's rise at court was nothing short of meteoric. Within a few short years, he went from being a young, relatively unknown nobleman to becoming the Duke of Buckingham, the king's most trusted advisor, and a figure of immense political power. Villiers's influence over James I reached unprecedented levels, and the queen found herself increasingly isolated. While James and Villiers shared a bond that transcended simple friendship, Anne's relationship with her husband became more and more distant. James's infatuation with his favorite, compounded by his often obsessive intellectual pursuits, left little room for Anne in his world. In many ways, James's reign was now being defined by his affection for Villiers, and the queen's place in court life was relegated to that of a passive observer. Of course, had known that royal favorites were nothing new. Her husband had always been surrounded by advisors and companions who sought his favor. However, the public nature of James's relationship with Villiers, and the fact that it was eclipsing his relationship with Anne, was deeply troubling to her. As her husband's affection for Villiers grew, so too did the queen's sense of alienation. Though she tried to maintain her composure, Anne's frustration with the situation was palpable. Her Catholicism, too, remained a source of tension. James, despite his relatively tolerant policies, could not completely dismiss the influence of the Protestant establishment at court. While the king personally sympathized with Catholicism, he knew that he had to maintain peace with the Protestant majority, who viewed Anne's religious beliefs as a threat to the stability of the kingdom. Her private devotions, her support of Catholic exiles, and her efforts to quietly advocate for religious tolerance were regarded with suspicion, and she found herself increasingly at odds with the court, with James focused on his favorites and court politics, and turned her attention to her surviving children, particularly her second son, Charles. Charles, born in 1600, was a quiet child, different from the charismatic and energetic Henry. Yet he possessed a certain regal dignity that his mother saw in him from an early age. Anne's maternal role became increasingly important, and she worked diligently to ensure that Charles received a proper education, while James was absorbed in his intellectual pursuits and played an active role in her son's upbringing. She made sure that Charles was exposed to the best tutors and scholars, and she did her utmost to prepare him for the eventuality of the throne, and was deeply involved in Charles's early education, ensuring that he was well-versed in classical literature, history, and the languages of Europe. She hoped that Charles would be able to bring about the kind of stability to the English monarchy that his older brother, Henry, might have done had he lived. Despite the personal distance between Anne and James, they shared a common goal: to ensure that Charles would grow into a wise and capable ruler. While Anne's influence was not as overt as that of her husband or his favorites, it was her nurturing role that left the greatest mark on Charles's development. She encouraged his artistic pursuits, fostered his intellectual curiosity, and was deeply protective of his well-being. However, despite her best efforts, Anne's influence over Charles would not be enough to prevent the storms that would eventually ravage the English monarchy. The political divisions in England, already exacerbated by James's struggles with Parliament and his reliance on favorites like Villiers, would come to a head during Charles's own reign. Anne's tragic early death meant that she would never live to see the full extent of her son's reign, which would be marked by the English Civil War and his eventual execution. As the years passed, Anne's health began to deteriorate. She had always been a woman of strong will, but the emotional and physical toll of her tumultuous marriage, her grief over Henry's death, and her increasingly frail health weighed heavily on her, and withdrew further from public life, and her presence at court became less and less frequent. Her duties as queen consort were largely ceremonial, and she spent much of her time in her private chambers, surrounded by a small circle of trusted companions. Her relationship with James, though never openly confrontational, remained fraught with tension. The king's reliance on Villiers, coupled with his intellectual preoccupations, meant that Anne found herself more isolated than ever. While she had once been a vital figure at court, her influence was now largely diminished. She had done what she could to protect her children and guide them through their formative years, but her role as a political player had been largely usurped by her husband's favorites. James, though emotionally distant, seemed to recognize the toll that the years had taken on Anne. He was not oblivious to the fact that she had suffered in silence, watching as the court dynamics shifted away from her. Yet, despite his recognition of her sacrifices, James could not bring himself to reconcile fully with his wife. His affection for Villiers was simply too consuming, and the queen was forced to accept her diminished role in the royal court. Anne's final years were marked by ill health and quiet resignation. Her influence at court had all but faded, and her once vibrant personality was subdued by the weight of her losses. Her death in March 1619, at the age of 44, came as a relief to her suffering. She had endured much over the years: personal loss, political marginalization, and the alienation from her husband. Her passing left a vacuum in the royal court. James, though mourning the loss of his wife, was already consumed by his relationship with Villiers and the complex political struggles that marked his reign. Anne's children, particularly Charles, were left to navigate a world in which their mother's quiet strength had once been their only constant. Her legacy, though overshadowed by the subsequent events of her son's reign, was one of resilience and had been a queen who had weathered the storms of personal grief, political turmoil, and religious conflict, though her influence on English politics was often indirect. It was through her nurturing of Charles and her quiet diplomacy that her mark was most deeply felt. In the spring of 1619, when Queen Anne passed away at the age of 44, England's royal court was left in a state of quiet mourning, and had been a queen consort who, despite her marginalization, had managed to carve out a space for herself in the annals of English history. However, her death left a gap that would never be filled. Her absence was keenly felt, especially by her surviving children, but none more so than by her second son, Charles, the future king. Charles was only 18 years old at the time of his mother's death, still young and somewhat inexperienced for the role that awaited him, and had been his primary maternal influence, guiding him through the difficult years of his upbringing with the hope that he would grow into a ruler capable of maintaining the balance between the crown and its increasingly restless subjects, and had nurtured Charles's potential and had seen in him a calm demeanor and a quiet dignity, traits that were often overshadowed by the force of James I's personality and the political machinations of the time. Her death, however, meant that her vision for her son's future would now be left to others, James and his court. James, though mourning his wife, did not appear to be as deeply affected by her death as one might have expected. His affection for her had waned in the years before her passing, and his relationship with his favorites, particularly George Villiers, had consumed much of his attention. The emotional distance between him and Anne had been evident in the latter years of her life. In some ways, James's grief was more political than personal, for Anne's death left a woman-shaped vacuum in the court, a space that could not easily be filled. Anne's absence had immediate consequences for the royal family. James's reign was already facing growing challenges, religious tensions, a weak relationship with Parliament, and a court deeply divided by factions. Yet Anne had always played a stabilizing role in the royal household. Without her, the court's dynamics began to shift even more dramatically. For Charles, the loss of his mother was a personal blow, and his ascent to the throne only months later after James I's death in 1625 compounded his grief. As the new King of England, Charles I inherited a kingdom rife with political instability. His reign was marked by personal ambition, but it would ultimately be defined by his struggle to assert royal authority in the face of growing opposition. Charles had been raised with the belief that kings were appointed by God to rule with absolute power. He had been taught to view the monarchy as a divinely ordained institution, one that should not be questioned by Parliament or the people. However, this absolutist view came into direct conflict with the political realities of 17th century England. The tension between the monarchy and Parliament had been building for years, and Anne's death did not alleviate the situation. In fact, it seemed to intensify the struggle for power. Charles's father, James I, had attempted to establish a more personal, direct form of royal rule, bypassing Parliament whenever possible. James's insistence on ruling without the full cooperation of Parliament had alienated many, including powerful factions within the English political elite. Yet, despite his deep attachment to royal prerogative, James had at least managed to maintain some semblance of peace during his reign, particularly in his later years. For Charles, however, the same approach would prove disastrous. His stubbornness in dealing with Parliament, combined with his inability to comprehend the growing dissatisfaction of the English people, created a volatile atmosphere at court and throughout the kingdom. The political divides that had existed during James's reign only widened under Charles's rule, and had always hoped that Charles would rise above the tensions and succeed in healing the rifts between the monarchy and its people. But Charles's early years on the throne were marked by poor decisions and an increasing inability to navigate the complex political landscape of 17th century England. Though Charles's reign would eventually descend into conflict and turmoil, it is impossible to overlook the influence of and in shaping his character. Even though she was no longer alive to guide him, and had instilled in her son a sense of duty and decorum that would serve him throughout his life. His natural calm, his intellectual curiosity, and his sense of dignity were traits that and had cultivated in him during his formative years. Anne's Catholicism, which had long been a source of tension at the English court, also left its mark on Charles. Although he never openly embraced Catholicism during his reign, his Catholic sympathies were widely known, and this religious disposition would contribute to the growing animosity between him and the Protestant factions in England. Moreover, Anne had raised Charles to be a monarch who, despite his deep religious convictions, should act with the understanding that the crown had a sacred duty to govern justly. This sense of responsibility, however, was often overshadowed by his rigidity and the immense pressures he faced as king. As the country slid into civil war in the 1640s, Charles's belief in the divine right of kings would lead him to make choices that alienated the very people whose support he needed to maintain his rule. Yet, despite his political failures, Anne's influence was evident in Charles's private life. He was known for his deep love for his wife, Henrietta Maria of France, and for his affection for his children, and had been a deeply loving mother, and this sentiment passed down to her son. Charles, though politically weak and often misguided, was a devoted family man who sought to maintain the bonds of his family even as the kingdom around him fractured. With Anne's death in 1619, the English court experienced a dramatic shift. The court had been an intensely political place throughout the early years of James I's reign, but Anne had always played a key role in maintaining a sense of civility and stability. Her presence had balanced out the chaos caused by the factional politics that revolved around James's favorite courtiers, particularly George Villiers, who had gradually gained near uncontested power. With Anne gone, James's reliance on Villiers grew even stronger. The Queen Consort had been a moderating influence, a voice of reason in an increasingly divided court. But with her death, there were fewer checks on Villiers's power. Villiers himself, who had risen from being a mere courtier to the Duke of Buckingham, assumed a much greater role in the royal household. His influence over James became complete, and the king's decisions were often dictated by Villiers's advice. For the court, the death of and marked a transition into a new era, one where the monarchy seemed to be defined more by personal allegiances and the will of the king than by the unity and governance that had once characterized the Tudor period. The rise of George Villiers and the increasing political and social fractures of the time were emblematic of the shifting tides of royal power. When Charles ascended to the throne in 1625, his reign was immediately defined by challenges. England was still deeply divided by religion, and tensions between the monarchy and parliament were at an all-time high. Charles, like his father before him, believed in the divine right of kings and sought to rule without the interference of parliament. This belief, however, was at odds with the growing sense of parliamentary power that had been developing since the reign of Elizabeth I. Anne's absence was felt deeply by Charles, not only because of her maternal influence but also because of the example she had set in her attempts to mediate between the crown and the people. Charles lacked the political skills to navigate the shifting dynamics of 17th century England. His early reign was marked by a series of ill-advised decisions that would have long-lasting consequences for the monarchy. His marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, further strained his relationship with the Protestant majority in England. The fear that Charles would attempt to bring Catholicism back into the country was widespread, and this distrust only deepened the divisions between the monarchy and parliament. By 1629, Charles had dissolved parliament, ruling without it for 11 years, and his actions were becoming increasingly unpopular with his subjects. While Anne had been a queen consort who had sought to maintain the unity of her family and her court, Charles's reign would mark the beginning of the end for the English monarchy as it had existed for centuries. Anne's hope for a peaceful reign of her son was dashed as England plunged into political and religious conflict. Though Anne's life was relatively short and her role in the royal court became increasingly secondary during the later years of her life, her legacy remained. She had played a pivotal role in the early years of James I's reign, serving as a moderating influence and as a queen consort who sought to maintain the peace. Her maternal influence on Charles was undeniable, and though her death marked the beginning of a turbulent period in English history, her quiet strength would continue to echo in the life of her son. Her legacy is one of devotion to her children, her faith, and the crown, despite the political challenges she faced and the personal struggles within her marriage, and remained a figure of stability during a time of great uncertainty. Though her influence may have been less overt than that of other royal women, her role in shaping the future of the English monarchy cannot be overlooked. By 1629, just 4 years after ascending the throne, King Charles I found himself in an increasingly precarious political position. His reign, though still young, was already marred by clashes with Parliament. His belief in the divine right of kings, that monarchs were appointed by God and should rule without interference, was in direct conflict with the rising power of Parliament, which sought to assert its influence over royal decisions. Charles's early attempts to rule without Parliament did little to quell the mounting tensions. His extravagant spending on wars in Europe, particularly the disastrous failed campaigns in the 30 Years' War, strained the royal coffers. To finance his military endeavors, he resorted to unpopular measures, such as the forced loans and ship money tax, which alienated the nobility and commoners alike. These actions were seen by many as arbitrary and tyrannical, laying the groundwork for rebellion. The echoes of Anne's own efforts to mediate between the crown and its people were now faint in Charles's increasingly authoritarian policies. As Charles struggled to manage his kingdom, his mother's legacy of cautious diplomacy and her efforts to balance the demands of both crown and court seemed lost, and had been a stabilizing force in James's reign, mediating between factions and trying to secure peace. Charles, however, lacked that same diplomatic skill. His interactions with Parliament became progressively hostile, and his dismissals of the very institution meant to support him weakened the monarchy further. By 1640, after a series of unsuccessful attempts to impose royal prerogative, Charles was forced to call the Long Parliament, a move he had long resisted but could no longer avoid. His attempt to manipulate Parliament backfired, and he found himself facing open resistance. The tensions between monarchy and Parliament reached a fever pitch. The country, divided by religious and political factions, stood on the brink of civil war. Charles, trapped by his own sense of divine right and political missteps, began to see enemies in every corner of his kingdom. His stubbornness, which he had inherited from his father James, proved to be his undoing. While James had struggled to balance his personal relationships at court with the political demands of the crown, Charles struggled to balance the monarchy with the will of his subjects. The outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642 marked the tragic culmination of a series of failed political decisions by Charles I. The war itself was not merely a struggle between royalist and parliamentary factions. It was also a clash of ideologies that divided families, friends, and even neighborhoods. At its heart was the question of whether the monarchy or Parliament should hold ultimate power. The roots of this conflict, however, stretched back much further than the reign of Charles I, extending to the deeply ingrained political and religious divisions of England, many of which Anne had attempted to navigate during her life. The Queen's death in 1619 had left a void at court, one that Charles, with his sometimes rigid and authoritarian personality, could never fill. Her passing had coincided with a period of immense change, and it was clear that her presence, if not her direct influence, had kept a semblance of peace during a time of internal tension within the monarchy. With Anne gone, the court became a battleground for power. James's favorites grew more influential, and the absence of Anne's moderating voice left the royal family exposed to more internal divisions. This fragmentation would only worsen as Charles's reign progressed. As the war raged on, the monarchy faced its greatest threat. Charles's leadership was increasingly questioned, not just by Parliament but by the very people who had once supported the monarchy. The royalist cause was beset by military defeats, financial difficulties, and internal dissent. Charles's inability to adapt to the changing political environment, an environment that Anne, had she lived, might have helped navigate, sealed his fate. In 1649, after years of conflict, Charles was captured, tried for treason, and eventually executed. His death was a moment of unparalleled shock for England and the monarchy, marking the end of an era. For Charles, who had grown up with a strong sense of divine right and royal privilege, the loss of his life was a profound tragedy. But for England, it was the beginning of an uncertain experiment in republican government. As the events of the Civil War unfolded, historians and royalists would often look back on the reign of Charles I with a sense of sorrow. Charles was a king who, at his core, sought to do what he believed was right. His mother had taught him a sense of duty to the crown, but this duty was ultimately a burden that he could not escape. Anne's legacy, though not often discussed in the political debates of the time, was present in Charles's personal life and governance. It was in his devotion to his family that her influence was most keenly felt. Anne had been a loving and protective mother, and in many ways, Charles's deep affection for his own wife, Henrietta Maria, mirrored the relationship he had with Anne. His love for his children, and his refusal to abandon them during the dark days of imprisonment, reflected the ideals of familial duty and loyalty that Anne had instilled in him. However, Anne's cautious diplomacy had not been passed down fully to her son. Charles's refusal to compromise with Parliament and his insistence on maintaining royal prerogative at all costs led to his downfall. Yet, in his final days, Charles showed a deep sense of personal dignity and calm, qualities that Anne had exemplified throughout her life. It was in these moments of quiet resolve that the spirit of and Dannemoch lived on. On the fateful day of January 30th, 1649, Charles I stood before the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The king, dressed in a simple black coat, his demeanor calm and composed, faced the inevitable. His death was not just the end of a monarch, but the end of an era. The execution marked the final, irreversible break between monarchy and Parliament, and England would never be the same. For many, the execution of Charles I was a symbol of the failure of divine monarchy in an age of growing political awareness. The royalists, who had fought valiantly for his cause, were now left with nothing but defeat and a sense of betrayal. But in the heart of the kingdom, Charles's death sent ripples through the national psyche, and many began to wonder what had gone wrong. In retrospect, Anne's influence on her son becomes clearer, while Charles's personal flaws, his inflexibility and his refusal to compromise, may have doomed him. The lessons his mother had instilled in him were still present, and had been a figure of grace and dignity, always looking to balance the conflicting forces at court. In the end, it was not her political vision that saved the monarchy, but her personal influence on Charles that had, for a time, held the royal family together. Though Anne Dannemoch never sought to wield political power overtly, her legacy lived on in the values she instilled in her children, her quiet strength, her devotion to her family, and her attempts to mediate between the crown and the people would echo through the reign of her son, Charles I, and beyond. Her influence, though often overshadowed by the political drama of her husband James's reign and her son's tragic end, played a subtle but undeniable role in the shaping of English history. In the years following Charles I's execution, the monarchy would be restored under his son, Charles I, but England would never return to the same political landscape. Though no longer alive to witness the shifts in power, would be remembered not only as a queen consort but as a mother who sought to preserve the monarchy during a time of immense internal conflict. Her legacy would be the foundation of Charles I's deep sense of duty, even if it ultimately led to his undoing. As historians reflect on the reign of James I, and later, the turbulent years of Charles I, they often point to Anne as a figure of stability, an understated queen who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that her family and the monarchy endured in an age of religious and political upheaval. Her death, though deeply mourned at the time, marked the beginning of an era of great change. But it also highlighted the quiet power that a consort could hold. In the end, and Sudan Mok, the queen who bridged kingdoms and survived many personal and political challenges, left a legacy far more significant than her contemporaries might have realized.